Part 6. Oh. Okay. Part 5. Got you there, didn't I? The meeting adjourned, and Mark tried to enjoy the next day and a half. The defensive trenches were done. Olga, after her appointment to the security committee, had taken over responsibility for them and was able to maintain worker morale so well that the work got done very quickly. Mark helped in the garden and spent some time with the kids. Timmy and Tommy were adjusting well, and they wanted to do everything David did. David told his dad that now he knew how Samantha had felt when they were younger. Mark made sure to spend some time just with David, and he tried to make himself available to Sam, but she seemed to want to spend all of her free time with Alex. As much as he tried to make himself relax, the thoughts of having to go back to the observation post and the eventual conflict that would bring hung over his head like a dark cloud. The minutes and hours seemed to drag by, but the 2 days were gone in a flash. It was such a paradox. Mark woke on Tuesday morning, the feeling of dread heavy on his heart. The trip back to the observation post was uneventful again. Mike met them at the truck, and the news he had was interesting. The MZB scouting party had come back Sunday afternoon, and 22 men had left yesterday morning in 3 trucks. Other than that, nothing extraordinary was happening. Mark visited with his brother briefly, and then he and his team made the hike to the observation post. When they arrived, Mark noticed that Ted seemed anxious to go home. Mark didn't blame him. He too was starting to hate this job. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, horns could be heard honking in the distance. Ralph was on watch, and he waved the other 2 men up to see what was happening. The 3 trucks Mike had told them had gone on the raid were pulling through the gate, and they parked in the center of the compound with the drivers still sounding the horns. Men rushed out of every cabin like ants from a disturbed anthill. All 3 onlookers immediately started counting. Mark, looking through his binoculars, had to start over several times, as the men were moving around too much for him to tell who he'd already counted. A few minutes later, John appeared in the doorway of the big cabin. He walked over and shook hands with the short, muscular man Mark had seen leave with the scouting party. He assumed this man was also the leader of the raiding party. Susie had identified him from Mark's description as the one called Snuffer. The 2 men spoke for several minutes. Mark wished he could hear what they were saying, but he was just too far away. The men in the compound had stopped scurrying around when John had appeared, and Mark was able to get an accurate count. There were 48 men standing around the trucks in the courtyard, including John and the short man. No one except for Snuffer had gotten out of the trucks yet. Since the fronts of the vehicles were facing Mark, he couldn't tell how many men they held. If all the men had come out of the buildings, and if Mike's count of 22 was correct, and if all 5 of the hidden guards were still at their posts, that made 74. Mark was excited by this revelation. If it was correct, then John hadn't increased his group size, and the plan they had should work. All they needed now was for him to send out a big group. "I count 48 standing out where I can see them," he whispered to Chaparro to confirm his number. "I only got 47. "I got 48, Ralph volunteered. "If that's all of them, then including the guards and the men who should still be in the trucks, they have 74 men. That's good news for us," he whispered. Chaparro nodded his head, and Ralph gave him a thumbs up. Mark turned his attention back to the compound. Looking through his Steiners, he saw John wave his arm. Mark figured that John wanted the men in the trucks to get out. His assumption was confirmed a minute later as men appeared out of the 3 vehicles. Most of them jumped out of the beds of the trucks and ran toward the back of the trucks they had ridden in. A minute later, they could be seen walking toward John, each carrying a box or bucket that appeared to be heavy. They made a line and set their bundles on the ground in front of them. Mark counted 18 men in the line. Mike had said 22 had left in the trucks. Including Snuffer, that meant that only 19 had come back. The karate man wondered where the other 3 were. Maybe they'd been killed. He hoped so.